Photorealism in Blender does not have to be difficult. In order to showcase this, today we're going to be looking at a shot that really anybody can do to achieve photorealism in Blender. As always, if you want to work along with us, you can download everything I use down in the description below, and also this time I'm providing the option for you guys to download my blend file so you can see exactly what I did. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is orientate our camera, and there's actually a program called fSpy that allows us to do that very easily and import that into Blender. Link is in the description to download that. So we're just going to launch fSpy once you've downloaded. We want to go ahead and drag our image into the project. So here's the image I have provided. We're just going to drag that into here, and now you can see it's opened it up. I'm going to go ahead and turn the dim image off, and then we have all these lines. We basically just want to line those lines up according to our scene. So I see these red lines. I'm going to line these up to kind of the edges of the table, trying to get them as straight as possible. And then I can also come over here and do the same thing with this kind of line. And then instead of making these the Y, since we don't really have any lines going in the Y direction, I want to set this to be our negative Z because that's going to be the up and down direction. And so I'm going to put this kind of trying to match the lines of this little plate here. And then I can also bring this line maybe to the side here, just something that is straight for our scene. And you can kind of play around with it. Right there is looking good. You can look at this little origin point, and if you move that around the scene, just make sure it looks flat. What you can also do, that I like to do, is go ahead and reference distance, we can go to the 3D guide and make sure that that is XY grid floor. And if you move that around the scene, you can see that the floor is roughly following the floor of the actual plate. And so now what we want to do is go ahead and save the project. I'm going to go File, Save, and then you just want to save this wherever you want it to be saved. So now we're done with fSpy. We want to come up here, go to X, and now we are inside Blender. We do want to install the fSpy add-on. So what you want to do is go to Edit, Preferences, and then in the add-on section, if you just hit install, you want to locate wherever you saved your zip file. And so once you click the zip file, you just want to install the add-on, and you should get something that pops up that says fSpy, like this, import fSpy project. That's the add-on that we installed, and you just want to make sure that's checked. So now what that allows us to do is if we X out of here, I'm going to hit A to select everything and just delete that real quick. And now we can come up to File, Import, and then at the very bottom, we now have fSpy. So I just want to locate wherever I save that file and import that in. Here we go. I'm going to import that in, and you can see that it's basically set up a camera named whatever our project was, basically the correct orientation. And so if I go ahead and hit Shift A to add a mesh plane, you can see now our plane is basically on the floor and orientated exactly how we want. Okay, so this is looking good so far. We can go ahead and select the camera. I like to come down here to the camera settings, background images, and change the opacity up just so we can see it a little bit better. Now what we want to do is go ahead and import in our model for our scene. So make sure to go ahead and download and extract those files. We're going to come up to File and then Append, and then we're going to locate that. So here's the model. I'm just going to double click inside of the blend file, and then we can go to Object and make sure we select all these objects and append that into our scene. Now you can see that it has appended it into our scene, but it's super tiny. And that's actually correct because if you come out here, I'm going to go ahead and press T to open up this side window and then measure. And then if I actually take a point here and then measure a point there, that's about 0.07 meters, which is roughly the size that the camera would actually be. And so depending on the model that you end up using, the modeler will actually set up a object to be the correct size or not the correct size. So luckily for us, this modeler actually decided to model it out to the correct size, which is very important for this scene because we have a lot of depth of field, and so we want the correct size to actually influence our camera's depth of field. So let's come back out to the camera view. We can go ahead and get back to our selection mode. I'm just going to hit T to hide that. So now what we need to do is scale our scene down so that the camera is the right size for our frame. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, Shift A, I'm going to add a empty plane axis. And then what I'm going to do is select the empty, and then I'm going to select my camera. And we want to make sure our empty is highlighted yellow up here. So I'm just going to Control click that. So now it's yellow. And then if we come down here, Control P, and I'm going to set the parent to object. So now what that's done is basically parented the empty or the camera to our empty. And so what we can do now is with our empty selected and not the camera, we can scale down the empty. And since it's parented, it'll scale down the camera as well. I'm just going to go ahead and H hide our plane. And again, select our empty and hit S to scale down. I'm roughly trying to get a good shape for our camera. So that looks pretty good. Okay, so now we have the camera kind of roughly following the actual size that it would be in our scene. And since it, again, was modeled to the correct size, now our camera is actually exactly, within the realm where the actual camera was filmed in real life. And so that's going to really help us to get photorealism in our scene. So I'm going to, with the empty still selected, I'm going to rotate on the Z axis. So hit Z and just kind of position the camera kind of somewhere I kind of like. That's looking good. And so now I'm going to hit Alt-H, come out here to the render engine, cycles, GPU compute. I'm just going to change some of the sample count down for now, just so we can get some nice renders, and turn the denoise off. We don't really need that yet. So now let's come to the rendered setting, and we can see that we don't have any lighting in our scene. Everything's looking a little messed up. And so what I want to do is go ahead and add a light to our scene. If we come back out to wireframe, you can see the lighting over here. If we look at this little plate back here, you can see the shadow is kind of going in this direction, which means that we have our key light coming from this direction. Another thing that you want to make sure is you match the shadows as closely as possible. And so if I come here, I'll notice that these shadows are very diffused, they're very soft, and so I want to try to replicate that with my camera as much as possible. So what I'm thinking the best solution is to actually do a area light. And so our area light is going to be basically a softbox light, which is going to give us a lot of diffuse shadows. So let's go ahead and add that in. I'm going to come up here to the rendered view again, and then I'm just going to Shift A, add a light this time, and then go to area. And now that's created an area light, we can go ahead and GZ shift that up. And now you can see that we actually have some shadows and lighting in our scene. It's not going the right direction. If you remember, if we come back here and go to wireframe, our shadow is coming from over here. So that means our camera needs to be positioned kind of over here. Maybe we'll rotate it on the X 90 degrees. We need to do negative 90 actually. So now if I come and go to the rendered view, we can see our shadow is roughly following that kind of area over here. I think it's a little bit kind of coming down into the right, so we actually need to, I'm going to move this on the X, and then I'm going to rotate it on the Z until we get a nice angle. So now that's roughly following kind of where our shadow is on the actual plate. You can see it's kind of roughly following that same direction. You can mess around with it on your own, but this is what I'm going to stick with. So now we notice that we still have our white plane here. And so what I'm going to do is go ahead and project our picture onto that plane. And so what we can do is come up to the shading tab. Then I'm going to go back into the camera view and then go to rendered. And so what we need to do is create a new material. I'm going to create that material. I'm going to just name it image for my sake. Then I'm going to add a image texture node right here. And it does help if you have the Node Wrangler add-on, so just make sure you have that selected. If you come up here, just type in Node Wrangler, make sure that's checked. And so what that is going to allow us to do is go ahead and we can plug it in here, and we can also view our image if we just hold Shift Control and then click that little image node. And since fSpy has already imported our image into our scene, we can go ahead and click that. You can see all the camera mapping data, but we can select this photorealism tutorial fSpy, and that's basically projected our image onto this plane. But with the Node Wrangler add-on, we can hold Control T, and we want to set this to be window, because that will project the vector to whatever we're viewing at, and since we're viewing from the camera, it's going to project it onto the actual plane. So now what we need to do, you can see there's this clipping error. We can actually set that to be mirror, and it's just, a little bit nicer of a view. And so now we can see that that's basically gotten our image onto our plane, but now it's erased our shadows, and that is actually because we are still viewing the image only. And so images don't really have lighting data. We actually need to plug that image into the principled BSDF, which we have here. And then if we Shift Control click the principled BSDF, now we can see that we have shadows, but also we have our plane, affecting the footage. So what we can do now is we're going to come here, and we want this plane to only project shadows on it. So we can go down here to object visibility and just set that to be a shadow catcher. And now we can see that we only have shadows here. We do have to come up here to the render properties, go down to film and change that to transparent. And now we can see the background footage. Okay, so now let's come back out to the layout tab. And so now what we want to do is basically try to match this lighting as closely as possible. So if we come down to the lighting data, we want to set the power up. So I'm just going to increase that until we get kind of a result that looks decent. So something like that looks good. What I will notice is that we are matching kind of the point, the key of our scene. But what we're not doing is we're not getting a lot of the ambient light for our scene. And so instead of adding kind of more area lights and affecting like that, I find for this scene what works for me is actually affecting the world settings. And so the world is basically the shading of the entire world around us. And so right now it's set to a default kind of gray value so that it doesn't really affect the scene that much. But what we can do is actually select the color of that. And if we come up, we want to change the luminance up just a little bit. Something like that, something until it matches our scene. And basically what that has done is created a lot more ambient light, basically surrounding the entire camera and using that to kind of blend in the scene like that. And so this is already a really good result. This is a really good model. So it's getting us a very photorealistic feel. The only thing that I really notice right now, and there are two things actually, you can see in our original image, we have a huge, kind of shallow depth of field effect. You can notice back here, everything is kind of blurry. And then even in the foreground, we can see everything is just super blurred out. Whereas our camera right now is super in focus, nothing's really being affected there. So what we need to do is try to copy that as much as possible. And so that goes back to why we actually zoomed in our camera the way we did. And that is to do with our f-stop. So if we come to our camera, we can just select the camera right here. We want to go down to the camera data, and then we can close out of that. I want to check depth of field. And so what depth of field is going to do is going to take this f-stop value and basically use that as a real life camera and affect kind of, what plane what the focal plane is going to be. And so what I like to do is go ahead and add another empty. I'm going to name this one focus. And so now if we go back to the camera, we can see that we have this depth of field focus object. I'm going to set that to be our focus empty. And so now wherever I have this focus empty is going to be where the actual camera is in focus. You can see the strap is in focus now. And now if I move back here, the camera is, more in focus. So let's actually come back out. I'm going to hide the camera real quick by hitting H. So let's select our focus plane. And you can see where in the image, kind of the focus is. You can see right here, it's super in focus, and then it kind of goes in and out here. So I'm just going to select the focus empty and place that roughly around there. Again, I want to try to keep that on the floor plane, because the floor plane is where the table would be. So this point is exactly kind of in the real world where the focus plane would be. And so now that we have the focus defined, we can Alt-H to unhide our camera. And you can see it's super out of focus. We want to actually move that camera back so it's more in focus. And so since it's such a shallow depth of field, it's going to be very hard to keep it all in focus, which is actually very realistic. So what I'm trying to do is kind of get this area in focus. I'm just going to move that back somewhere around there. That looks pretty good. So now kind of, this is where I'm trying to focus. You can even do the lens. If you wanted to do like the lens, you can, move the lens into that and then you get, something like that, which might be what you want to do. We'll go ahead and do that for this example, for this tutorial. And so now this is looking pretty decent. I might actually go back to the light. I can see it's very kind of, kind of bright, too bright down here. So I might go to the light again and maybe affect, the power. Might even turn down the size a little bit. The size is just the kind of the spread, how sharp the shadows are going to be. Might turn that down to like a 0.6 maybe. That's looking a little bit better. Again, I'm just trying to match to this shadow back here. Okay, so that is already looking really realistic. I think we're ready to go ahead and render out an image and start compositing this. So let's go up to render an image. Okay, so here is our render. You can see that we don't really have our image in, we just have the camera. And so we actually need to go to the compositing tab and go ahead and set up some nodes. So come here, I'm going to hit use nodes up here. And then again, we're just going to go ahead and hit alpha over. This is basically how you composite in Blender and make layers. And so I'm going to add that. I'm going to add a image node and then open up again our image we used before, or fSpy image, and then I'm going to plug that up top. Again, whatever is on top is actually going to be below whatever is on bottom. It's kind of a backwards, kind of thinking, but it still works. I'm going to hit V to just zoom out a little bit, and you can see this is the result that we're getting. Now, if this is, good enough for you, then that's totally good. What I will notice is, if I wanted to get this super realistic, I'll notice that the shadow is a little bit different from the two. This shadow is a little bit darker and, more black looking, whereas this shadow over here is more red. It has a lot of more red values in it, and that's actually to do with a couple of things, mostly the bounce light. In the scene, you can see like this stuff up here is more red and orange, so it's kind of giving a little bit of a bounce to kind of this thing over here. But mostly, you can see that this table is made out of wood, and so whatever surface that the shadow is going on, it's going to inherit some of that color. And so right now we don't really have a way to control the shadow without also controlling the camera. So let's actually set up another pass in order to separately affect the shadow from the camera. So let's come out from Layout tab, and there are many ways to do this. The way I find is messing around with the view layers. So what I want to do is I want to come over here, right click, and I'm going to create two collections. So collection 2 and 3. Let's name this collection. I'm going to name this one camera. And then this one, I'm just going to name shadow. And so we need to go ahead and place the specific objects inside of those. So I'm going to select the camera, both the strap and the camera. I'm going to, of course, place those in the camera collection. And then our plane here, which is the floor, I'm just going to place in the shadow collection. So now if we come up here, I'm going to select this to be on. And basically what that is the indirect pass for, each view layer. And so what I'm going to do is basically indirect affects the thing but isn't rendered. And so if I come up here and I'll select this to be indirect, you can see that we're not seeing the camera anymore, but everything that it affects in the scene is still being seen, such as the shadows. And so if we have that selected, we can have that be our shadow view layer. And then I'm going to come up here and add a new view layer. And if you know anything about what compositing is like, we're just going to do the opposite. And so now we're going to do a view layer set to that to indirect only. And so now we have two view layers, one set to be our shadow only, and then one set to be the camera only. And so now what that is going to allow us to do, if we come up here to compositing, we can actually go ahead and we want to change this one to be our camera. And then we want to go ahead and control, copy and paste that. And then we want to come down to shadow. So now we have two separate render layers. They're not seeing anything for now because we haven't rendered out anything. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. Okay, so once your render has finished, you can see that we no longer have our shadow in this. And that's actually because if we come out to the compositing, we only have these two render things being combined and sending to our composite. So what we can do now is we want to put the shadow below our camera, but still in front of our footage. So to do that, again, we just need to add a new alpha over. I'm going to plug that in there. We want the camera to be on top of everything, so I'm going to put that in the bottom socket. And then the shadow I want to be on kind of in between the camera and the footage. So I'm going to put that there. So now we're basically combining everything into one again. Come over here. What we need to do now is we need to affect just the color of our shadow. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a color balance node right here. I'm going to put that just on the shadow layer. And so now what that is going to allow us to do is basically just affect the kind of color of the shadow and match that as closely to our scene as possible. Now this is a step I would normally do in Nuke, so I'm a little bit of a beginner at Blender compositing, and honestly I recommend you guys do a compositing program. If you want a free one, I recommend Fusion, which is DaVinci Resolve's compositing software. Blender is just so slow and honestly doesn't have that great of nodes, but to just stick inside of Blender for this tutorial, What I'm going to do is I'm going to change the hue to be kind of a reddish color. So if I come down here and select pure red for the gamma, you'll notice that nothing has happened. And this is a very bizarre thing that happens in Blender. This node is very messed up, and another reason I don't like compositing in Blender. What we actually have to do is come over here and set the lift value. For some reason it's the lift, and we have to set that value to something above a 1. So I'm just going to do a 1.01. And as soon as we do that, you can see it now affects our color. I don't know why it does it. It seems to be an issue with just like blacks in general. So that's the workaround to do that. You'll notice it's kind of affecting the entire image, and that's because we're affecting everything in the image right now. We actually want to set this alpha to be the factor, and so now it's just affecting kind of the area of the shadows. And so now that we have this red color, you'll notice that it's way too much. So what we can do to solve that is actually click this little red icon, and I like to change the saturation down. Now that we have like a nice red, we can change it down until we have something that roughly matches. And so now we have kind of the hue right, but the light, isn't that dark. And so what we actually need to do, you can do this in compositing. I don't really like doing that too much in compositing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back out here, and I actually need to go ahead and mess around with the light again. So layout, and then we can I'm just going to hide it, re-enable that for now. And I'm going to come to the area light, maybe just going to increase the power a little bit, trying to get like darkness down here and stuff, trying to match that to that as much as possible. And then maybe change the size down just a tad, like maybe around a 0.5, something like that. So now that we have darker shadows, this is also a good time to go ahead and change our view transform. It's set by default to filmic, and that's actually really good if you're wanting to correct colors for just rendered objects. But what that's going to do is going to affect our image layer. And so for the sake of this tutorial, we're not going to have to worry about color transforms or anything. I'm trying to keep it as super basic as possible. I'm going to change this color management to standard. Again, this isn't the workflow if you want super realism, and you would want to mess around with the color transform and change that and all that stuff. But for the sake of this beginner tutorial, I'm going to set that to standard. So now we can come up here to the compositing tab, and now that looks a little bit more integrated. And so we need to go ahead and render out an image again just to update our shadow, and we can check that. I actually just remembered that I forgot to disable the thing I did, so I'm going to set this back to indirect only, and now we can render out a shot. So here we go. We just rendered out another image, so we need to change around the settings because that is way too red. So again, just come out to compositing. This is kind of the thing of compositing, just going back and forth, trying to render it out. So now we can come back here and just change the saturation down a little bit. And something like that is looking pretty good. You can play around with maybe the gain just a tad. So like here's before. If I mute that, you can see it's super dark, super kind of not integrated in the scene. Then we're just lightening that up a bit. I might even change the gain down just a little bit more. I even change the luminance value over here down a little bit too. Again, just playing around with it. That looks pretty well matched. You got to remember the shadow is going to be a little bit more black since the camera is black. And it's not receiving that bounce light. And so now you can see that we're getting this result, which is actually really, really good. And very photorealistic. So the final thing that I kind of want to do is I want to go ahead and get some of this noise out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change around with the sample count. I'm going to make my render samples. I like to stick around like a 256. I find that anything beyond that, kind of just eats into render time. And then I like to come over here. I'm going to go make sure I'm in the camera view layer up here. And then I want to come to the view layer properties. I'm going to enable denoising data. And then I can go ahead and add a denoise node. And I'm just going to do this for the camera. The shadow, you won't really see any, denoise stuff for it. I'm going to go ahead and plug the normal into the normal and albedo into the albedo. And then just going to double check everything is correct. And since this is just an image, we don't have to mess around with any of the output properties since you can just save it once you render the image. So now all of that is set up, we can go ahead and render out a final image. Okay guys, so here is the final result. Hopefully you're a little less intimidated by photorealism inside Blender and learned a thing or two that will help you along your journey. It'd mean a lot to me if you guys consider liking and subscribing to help me out with the YouTube algorithm. But anyways, thanks for watching and I will see you in the next video.